Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mike. You guys are rocking with me on Mike's Intellectual Corner. On today's episode, we are diving into some potential history. This is Germany could not win World War II. And just like always, we're just going to dive right into it. So let's roll.
There, I've finished fine-tuning my what-if machine. It can answer any what-if question accurate to within 1/10 of a plausibility unit. Who wants the machine to show them an alternate reality?
I want to know.
If Germany wins, if Hitler stops making decisions.
Who else has a question for the what-if machine? I have one.
Do they win if they mass produce the mouse tank?
Make that machine show me what would happen
if they took Moscow.
That's so plausible, I can't believe it.
People love rooting for the underdog. These stories strike a chord with it.
Well, last time I checked, freaking like on his last video that we watched on Operation Barbarossa, the Germany had horrible planning before this even took place. Anyway, like they did horrible planning on the population of Russia. They did horrible planning on all that stuff. Even the infrastructure. That's what I mean. Like, you know what I'm saying? I'm sure that's why they took such heavy tanks and trucks and everything on such horrible roads as they did. So it's just like, you know what I'm saying, the whole pre-planning of it, just all of it was just crap. But let's keep going now.
I can't believe it.
People love rooting for the underdog. These stories strike a chord with us at a very basic level, and you can tell this by how popular these stories are in media. This also translates to real-world stories, although real life does not have a plot that always turns in the underdog's favor. So there's this kind of romanticism connected to fighting for a lost cause that a lot of people assign to a lot of real-world groups. One of these you see talked about a lot is the German army in World War II, that if only dumb Hitler hadn't been in charge, or if different choices were made, that the war would have turned out different. And a lot of these arguments seem to hold water on the surface, but upon reflection, mostly miss the point or do not make a significant enough change to sway anything. These are my favorite how Germany could have won scenarios, and how they're wrong. I hear this one all the time, that if the Germans had just driven onto Moscow and taken it, the Russians would have capitulated.
I mean, again, of course that wouldn't have correlated to anything, because I mean, the plane did the same exact thing. We saw what happened there. Even though, obviously, by this time, Moscow was like the main place for in Russia, as back then it was, St. Petersburg. Still, like, I feel like, you know what I'm saying? It wouldn't have went that way. I mean, even then, St. Petersburg was under siege, so I don't know, still though.
Moscow and taken it, the Russians would have capitulated. But it is rarely backed up with evidence as to why. Even in the memoirs of German generals after the war, they constantly mention that the drive to Moscow would have meant victory in the East. And I think the reason for this is that they model the Russian campaign after the French campaign. In the French campaign in 1940, the French surrender once Paris is cut off from its forces and looks like it's about to fall. Using this model, a lot of people think that the exact same would apply to Russia. The only problem with this is Russia is a whole different animal, both politically and geographically. Stalin was going to put every man, woman, and child in the Soviet Union between him and the advancing Germans.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say, the difference is the fact that you're dealing with a regime and millions of people that, you know what I'm saying, obviously Stalin cared about, but obviously kind of didn't care about. So, you know what I'm saying, as in, obviously, like how he's saying, whereas with France, they weren't going to put every man, woman, and child in front of the German blitzkrieg to, you know what I'm saying, save the country. You know, obviously, once the soldiers were done fighting, it was over. Whereas, not to mention, but those were also two different wars, though, too. Out west with France, they're just trying to knock them essentially out of the war. With Russia in the east, they're trying to kill everyone so that they can take that land over and start moving Germans into it. You know what I'm saying? So it's two different battles and wars, but I don't know.
Stalin was going to put every man, woman, and child in the Soviet Union between him and the advancing Germans, and this is exemplified by the way the Red Army fought the war, often trading casualties for time. So if Moscow was taken, sure, it's a political and also logistical defeat, given that the rail network was centered around it, but no way do I think Stalin is just going to shrug and say, well, we tried, after Moscow was taken. And with that, we would probably see the Soviet Union fighting to the bitter end, just like the Germans did in reality. This is also backed up by real-world history from Napoleon's Russia campaign in 1812, where he went on to take Moscow but still lost the war. Russia is such a large and vast country that they have the ability to trade casualties and land at a higher rate than any other country can, and therefore the normal rules of war such as taking the capital and ensuring victory do not apply.
Are they not seeing this?
Another commonly heard point is that Hitler made terrible decisions and he should have just listened to his generals. Now, I'm not here to defend Adolf Hitler, he's a crazy genocidal maniac, let's not make two ways about it. But this isn't always the case. For example, Hitler and the High Command were all in agreement on invading Russia. They all very much wanted to, in their eyes, destroy communism and save Germany, as Hitler laid out in his book. But once this effort was undertaken, Hitler and his generals began to disagree at times on what moves needed to be made. And once the war is over, many generals in their memoirs...
But again, like I said before, a lot of the logistical things that should have been taken care of, especially in Operation Barbarossa, should have been taken care of by those generals that were in charge of them, weren't taken care of by those generals. So it wasn't just Hitler's fault; it was those generals and some of their planning and some of the stuff that they either knew in the back of their mind wasn't going to work, and they didn't speak up, or were so riding on such a high with everyone else in the country that they didn't see it in the forefront or whatever. But
began to disagree at times on what moves needed to be made. And once the war is over, many generals in their memoirs begin to claim that Hitler made all the bad decisions, and that if he had just listened to them, the war would have been won. And one example of this I already hinted at in the former point. Hitler's generals were convinced that taking Moscow would end the war for many erroneous reasons I listed previously. For Hitler, Moscow was a general direction in which to head, but was not the final objective. For him, the resources in the Ukraine and the oil fields beyond were a much more important target. And given Germany's oil shortages, this is a good example of where Hitler was right and his generals were wrong. And actually, a lot of Hitler's so-called mistakes start to make a whole lot more sense once you put it into the context of Germany's fuel shortages. And if you want more information on this, Tick did an excellent video on Germany's oil problem that you should really check out. Another example of this sentiment being wrong is Operation Citadel in 1943. Hitler's generals convinced him that an attack on the Kursk Bulge would cripple the Red Army and renew Germany's initiative in the war. Hitler saw this plan as very flawed, though, famously saying, "Every time I think about Operation Citadel, my stomach turns over." And seeing how poorly this turned out for the Germans, his premonition was eerily correct. Now, if this was the caricature of Hitler always overriding his generals that is commonly seen, Citadel would have been called off before it was launched.
I mean, Battle of the Bulge and D-Day come to mind. But I mean, even then, really D-Day, not even really him doing shit. It just really showed to mind just how bad their structure was, and the fact that his generals just couldn't do anything without him anyway, because they couldn't even set up defensive structures to save their country without his say-so, and he was sleeping, so...
Now, these are just two quick examples, and yes, there are times, especially later in the war, where Hitler overrules his generals with poor decisions. The Battle of the Bulge comes to mind. But early in the war, when these decisions really count, Hitler is many times making the right decisions when overruling his generals, or going along with them in agreement of a common goal. So, Hitler should have just listened to his generals and he would have won the war, is a moot point. Because many times he did, and his generals were wrong, and many times he didn't, and he turned out to be right.
It's all Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler.
This is actually a point I used to subscribe to. A very honest critique of the German war economy is that it was not on the right footing. And people make this argument usually saying things like, Germany should have just made more Panzer IVs instead of pouring resources into the Tiger. Or, Germany should have built the Luftwaffe back up so they could regain air superiority. And I will give you that the German war economy in many places was an absolute nightmare. John Parshall does an excellent lecture on tank production in World War II and really highlights how backwards the German production process was for armored vehicle manufacturing, and mentions how that knowledge can be applied to other types of...
But I mean, at the end of the day, we gotta remember, I mean, this country did just come out of World War I, out of all the depression, and like, you know what I'm saying, they're one of the worst countries hit out of the Great Depression. So it's just one of those things where it's like, although, yeah, they weren't where they probably needed to be, where, ramping their materials and stuff up, it's still pretty impressive what they did under the type of stress and situation that they were in. I mean, they were just out of what hyperinflation to where a freaking a tub of money is worth like freaking $2. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's pretty impressive. So
manufacturing, and mentions how that knowledge can be applied to other types of war manufacturing. And although once Spear takes over, production is streamlined to a degree, and munitions and weapons production goes up year by year, it's not near where it needs to be to fight this attritional war. So obviously, the solution is to just streamline production, sort of how you see in the American model, and this would have given Germany a better chance in the war. Although this is a good criticism, it misses the core issue. The biggest thing Germany was running low on from 1942 onward is, as I mentioned before, oil, and larger numbers of tanks and planes wouldn't be any good if there was no fuel to run them. Also, Germany was having manpower shortages as early as 1942 or 43, and along with fuel to run these machines, you need people to crew them. These are just two issues that cannot be remedied by streamlining production. At a certain point, Germany is just going to be out of oil and out of men, and no amount of additional tanks or planes would operationally be possible.
What's the matter? Run out of gas?
Kinda embarrassing.
This is another point that deceptively seems to make a lot of sense, as Germany was crushed by a two-front war. It stands to reason that if Japan and Germany through their alliance had coordinated an attack on Russia, they would have won. And that may honestly be true. A big boost to the defense of Moscow came after Russian troops from Siberia were sent west after the Russo-Japanese Non-Aggression Pact. The only problem with this is that coordination did not and was never going to happen. Germany and Japan were allies by circumstance and shared no real common goals.
yeah, if I'm not mistaken, like the Russian front, the Japanese didn't really want that much from Russia. Like they just wanted the control over the Manchuria area and those islands up north, pretty much. Like they didn't really care about all that desolate wasteland essentially out there. They wanted their China and Indochina empire pretty much. But
Germany and Japan were allies by circumstance and shared no real common goals with each other. And in fact, they're operating in opposition to each other at times. German training of Chinese troops in the 30s as they were fighting the Japanese is a direct example of this. In short, neither side was going to stick out its neck for the other. In fact, Russia as a common enemy was probably the only instance in which they would have, and even then they did not. The reason for Japan not wanting to do this is mostly colored by the Japanese experience against the Soviets at the Battle of Konkangal, please forgive my pronunciation, where the Red Army gave the Imperial Army a very bloody nose in an undeclared border conflict. This incident convinced the Japanese to not go through with any action that would provoke the Soviet Union, as they did not want war with them, since they were already fighting China and would soon be fighting the United States. This avoidance of provoking the Soviet Union went far enough that during the war in the Pacific between Japan and the United States, the Japanese refused to sink any U.S. merchant ships headed to the Soviet Union. So
I mean, it showed too when with the Japanese POWs in Russia, because I'm pretty sure all the Japanese soldiers who were stuck in the Manchuria province were shipped off to Russia at the end of the war, and if I'm not mistaken, they were only imprisoned up there for like maybe 3 years at the most for most of them, and they were given like way better food supply and all that, and like clothes supply than say the Germans, because obviously Russia hated the Germans at this time. But you know what I'm saying. So a lot of them I know were able to get back home pretty fast, whereas Russia with Germans, they were pretty much there for decades, and they were lucky if they were able to get back home. But yeah. So I guess that it kind of shows there that in fact, Japan didn't really want to do anything with Russia and stuff like that.
merchant ships headed to the Soviet Union. So the Japanese attacking the Soviet Union directly flies in the face of the intentions and characteristics of the Japanese High Command, to the point where it strays out of potential history,
Kill yourself.
into the realm of fantasy.
You have screwed me again.
Japan.
This is my favorite one. If they had just made insert ridiculous design here, the war may have gone differently, and it's the idea that this thing, or this thing, or this thing would somehow have single-handedly lengthened the war. There are a few fan favorites for pics of these. The one I see most often being the Mouse, the ridiculous 200-ton behemoth that in reality would have been awesome target practice for Allied fighter bombers and something for Allied soldiers to gawk at once it had run out of fuel and had to be abandoned. Or German jet aircraft, that although cutting edge and superior to what the Allies had, still couldn't have been applied in a large scale due to the aforementioned fuel and personnel problems. And the list for these things goes on and on. A personal pet peeve of mine in this category is the what-if question about the German atomic program, and the claim that if they had applied themselves, the Germans could have come up with an atomic weapon.
The main and obviously the big number one person who would have helped them do that was Albert Einstein, who was could have obviously helped him, but instead helped us with creating that. So it's just one of those things where, you know what I'm saying, I don't know why they didn't think that. It's just so stupid in their thinking, you know what I'm saying, and thinking that you know what I'm saying, geniuses couldn't be any and everywhere, essentially. And they were literally expelling some of the best minds in their country. It's crazy thing about it, yeah.
Atomic program, and the claim that if they had applied themselves, the Germans could have come up with an atomic weapon first. This notion, though, just like that of Japan invading Russia, very quickly falls into the category of fantasy once looked at for three main reasons. One, many of Germany's top scientists were expelled in the 30s for being Jewish, automatically limiting German atomic capabilities. And actually many of these scientists went on to work in the American nuclear program. So to make this win scenario work, you automatically have to make the Nazis tolerant of Jews, which is not going to happen. Two, the German atomic program is all but cancelled by 1942. As Speer put it, we got the view that the development was very much at the beginning. The physicists themselves didn't want to put much into it. Which works into my third point, that Hitler saw atomic science as Jewish science, and pointed the focus of German development towards conventional weapons. So we're not even talking about an atomic race between the US and Germany, as it was barely being pursued by the Germans. And to give a what-if scenario about it would fly directly in the face of what Hitler stood for. And this gets into the bigger problem with this question, that even if Germany does produce these wonder weapons, and extends the war, it's only going to extend it long enough to be the first country to get nuked, due to the Germany First policy of the Allies.
Are you making a jet plane? Or a remote control that can turn you into super soldier? Or is it just another dumb tank?
Now these are just a handful of points that people bring up when talking about how Germany could have won, but there are many more that I didn't go into that are equally baseless, such as the Germans should have and could have invaded England, even though the Kriegsmarine would not be able to support a large amphibious attack, and the much larger Royal Navy would have probably sunk the invading force before it even reached the shores. Or that Barbarossa should have taken place earlier, even though it wasn't really the winter or the rainy season that stopped the Germans, it was a lack of supplies that needed to be brought up. For more info on that, check out this lecture by David Stahill. You'll see people bringing up scenario after scenario that bends reality and character motivations very widely to craft a scenario that Germany could win. But here's my point. Germany would not have won World War II no matter what way you slice it. The fact of the matter is...
Personally, in my opinion, the only way that that's going to change is if... because, yeah, they were a small country and they didn't have that much resources, but at the end of the day, if they just didn't, provoke Russia, then they could have maybe have gotten away with it, because the only real country that they were having to deal with was Britain. And, yeah, they weren't, giving up, but eventually, what I'm saying, who's to say that they probably wouldn't have given up? And especially... and with that war, the mass genocides might not have even have happened, because the only reason that happened was mainly because Poland didn't know what to do with all their Jewish population in Poland, and the fact that they were having to deal with the war, they couldn't just, deport them. It was just, especially with Britain and stuff. So without that, they could have, went along with their plan in deporting their Jewish population to Madagascar or to one of the French colonies that they now control. So, I don't know, it's just one of those things, but, yeah.
The fact of the matter is, this is a country that is too small and too short on resources to take on the three largest world powers at once, especially given the erroneous actions and motivations they have. Basically, the Germans dealt themselves a bad hand and played it poorly. And the only way that's going to change is if you bend time and space to their liking with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, all things that are not going to happen in reality.
Alright guys, so yep, that was actually pretty good. I kind of miss Potential Issue. He hasn't posted in freaking 5 months. He's been gone for a while now, but hopefully he starts posting again. But in any case, if you guys like the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you guys want to see, I'm out. Peace.